I have a hard time answering that question of yours because, on the whole, in my 40 years as a researcher, I've been, on the whole, methodologically, I've been conservative. But I've been very non-conservative in terms of the questions I ask. A subject which has had such great minds developing it, like Adam Smith, David Ricardo, Malthus, John Stuart Mill, and in our own century, people like, more recently, people like Kenneth Arrow. The methods developed are probably pretty good, because these are outstanding minds. They would have been good at anything they did. So that's okay. I'm not sure that we don't have the tools, or we've got the wrong tools. I think on the whole we've asked very often the wrong questions, although the tools are there. Or put it this way, we have continued to ask questions which have become very boring, but they're still being asked. And so you keep on working on them. Whereas there are some phenomenally difficult questions to answer, which either we are scared of asking them because we don't know how to answer them. Or sometimes, of course, it has to be acknowledged that politics gets in the way and we don't want to ask them because it's awkward. I can't imagine that there weren't very bright people in the 80s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, young people, who were not doing seriously interesting work. I can imagine that many of them were doing extremely boring work, largely because it was tailored to the cultural, where promotions would be easier and so forth. So that the incentives, I think in many ways were wrong. But the incentives were wrong not because, I don't believe it's because mathematics is too powerful in economics. I don't believe that. I don't think it's maths. It's ideology comes in the way. I think in the 80s it was very difficult. Let me give you an example. I had, in the early 80s, I started working on what turned out to be some of my best work on the pathways by which people become very poor and remain poor. Poverty traps. Question, can people fall into a poverty trap? I was convinced, and I have very good mathematical models showing it, but it was a problem which simply was not taken seriously in the development field, economic development field. Although sub-Saharan Africa was going down the tube, and yet poverty traps were not really acknowledged as a possible, viable process, pathway. People were willing to acknowledge that Africa was in deep trouble, that people were very poor. But they were describing and then saying, oh, the way to handle is for them to turn liberal, to have liberal economic policies. The possibility that there may be some forces at work, and I don't mean Marxian forces, I mean literally pathways by which people fall into traps, was not really acknowledged. This was a time when trickle-down theory was very prominent. Trickle-down means if you go for growth, then that growth will filter down to the poorest. Now, I wanted to argue that even if that happens, you could still have people locked in there. Now, this was in the early 80s. So I was absolutely alone with only 2-3 people, one co-author of mine and a few others, who took poverty traps very seriously. It wasn't until about 15 years later that poverty traps started being taken seriously amongst mainstream economists. Now, it's not because I was a Marxist, or I wasn't, nor because I wasn't using the proper tools. I'm a mathematical economist. But it was the questions and the way I was posing them, they were not felt to be justified. So I wouldn't think, in the context that you are talking about, that we have to redo economics. I think we just have to ask the question that is, and we have neglected hugely, we have neglected cooperative enterprises in recent decades, although there was a literature on the labor-managed economy, as you know, in the 70s, I think. 60s, 70s, I think. But it sort of fell by the wayside, partly because there were some important questions that were raised, which was, do people have the right incentives in a labor-managed economy as compared to, and will they not be sort of weeded out through lack of capital? Why would people invest in labor-managed economies if part of the return on the investment go to somebody else? That was a standard argument, and it's an important argument. But instead of then asking whether non-profit organizations could be made to be viable, and what needs to make them viable, and what might be the reasons a society might encourage their development to complement the profit-making firms and make them viable, that wasn't asked. Because the presumption was that if it's slightly costly to make them viable, then we shouldn't touch it. So I would say that there's a lot of problems that we ought to be posing now. And maybe we will, because this last crisis has been a real eye-opener to many people who felt this was the only way to go about things.